understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How you doing there? John is spluttering down the far end of the line here. Welcome to the podcast. I mean, I know we've said it before that Lenin observed that there are decades when nothing happens and there are weeks when decades happen. In fact, there are days now where decades are happening. By that, I mean, there are things happening now every day that are upending the status quo of decades, that are upending the central case position of decades, that are upending diplomacy, upending economics. It's extraordinary stuff, John. And I am here in the Gotthard Pass of all places in Switzerland. This is the final installation of our our mini-series of
I hope you're
travels.
wrapped up well, Mac. I hope you're wrapped up well.
I am wrapped up because it's absolutely freezing. It is Travels with David McWilliams. So we were started in Zagreb, then we got the bus to Venice, and then we got the train from Venice to a lovely, lovely place called Lucerne in Switzerland, where I am visiting our old mate, Mr. Murphy.
Yes, that's a beautiful place. You're like the Michael Palin of podcasting.
Of economics, the Michael Palin of economics. Now, interestingly, we're going to start in the Gotthard Pass, John. We're going to talk about the Treaty of London, the flight of the Earls, the Irish involvement in this part of the world, and we're going to link the Treaty of London and the flight of the Earls. So that's 1604 and 1607, John.
Ooh,
just to get your head around it, right?
Making notes as we speak.
With what has happened in the last few days on Ukraine, Russia, America, Europe, and what looks to be the American efforts to tear up the status quo of the last 70 years, if you go back as far as 1945, but at least the last 30 years, if you go back to the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall. You might remember, John, we did a podcast a couple of weeks ago talking about the big economic super cycles, that things go in these 4-decade cycles. We are now definitely at the inflection point of a super cycle. We are at the end of the post-Berlin Wall peace, in effect, between Europe and Russia, policed by America and implemented by NATO. I think it's all change. God knows where we're going to go. But
well, I'll tell you what, where we're going to go is Mars is becoming more and more attractive by the day.
Well, in actual fact, the fascinating thing about in reality, when you're in Switzerland, this is a country that is neutral. It is neutral, it is a safe haven, but more to the point, it is a country that is neutral that can defend its neutrality, that has a massive army.
Yeah.
Swiss kids continue to go to the army. They do 2-year service, 1 year straight up, and then over the course of your life between the age of 18 and I think 35, you do, I think, 3 weeks on, 3 weeks off, 3 weeks on every year.
Yeah.
But this is a country that takes its neutrality incredibly seriously. And by that I mean it fronts up, it can defend itself. It is the most heavily armed country in the world. There's more firearms in Switzerland than there are in America per head.
Yeah.
And there's very little gun crime.
Yeah.
So you have the opposite to America. You've got a neutral country. They're all tooled up, but they're actually very, very peaceful. We might talk about this I
think that's an issue. And I think we've kind of touched on it very, very briefly on a number of occasions. But the issue of neutrality and Ireland's neutrality is, it's untenable now. And whether we remain neutral or not, we got to tool up. We have to tool up. We have a responsibility to do so.
Tooling up. But what I'm saying is, John, let's get there, right? Because one of the consequences of what is happening could well be that countries like Ireland have to make a choice about, do you want to join a European army or not? Because if America leaves Europe and leaves NATO, Europe is going to have a mandatory army with no countries opting out. Because if you opt out, then other people say, well, why, they can opt out, why can't we opt out, etc. So we get to this. That's what I'm saying. Days are happening where decades are being torn up. But I am looking here, John, the Gotthard Pass, right? So the Alps, crossing the Alps ever since the time of Hannibal, has been the holy grail of missionaries, of traders, of merchants, of armies, always to get to the prize that is Italy. And we were in Venice last week and we spoke about the prize that is Italy, the sophistication, the Renaissance, the money, the gold, the wealth, all that sort of stuff.
You're doing the reverse journey.
I'm doing the reverse journey. I'm running away from Italy. But this pass, the Gotthard Pass, was one of the very few passes through the Alps. And it was passed through by all sorts of people. The fascinating story is I was walking down here, John, and I'm looking at a beautiful, beautiful church, absolute granite church, okay? Tiny. And the church is called St. Columbanus Kirche.
Right.
And I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, this is a very unusual name, Columbanus. And it goes back to the 7th century when Columbanus, the Irish monk, brought scriptures to St. Gallen up the road here, where he set up a monastery. And there had been this extraordinary connection between Ireland and Switzerland from these 7th and 8th century monks.
Yes.
Explaining why the churches have got names that are not Swiss. That's the first thing. That are
this
Irish.
is during Charlemagne's time as well. He was encouraging all this.
Oh, yeah, all this sort of thing, because the Christianity, they wanted to spread Christianity because they were worried about all sorts of other religions, particularly Islam, etc.
Yeah.
But in this church, John, there's a plaque outside the church. And the plaque outside the church is dated March 1608. And it says, and I'm going to read it here.
Yeah.
It says in Latin, German, and English, but not in Irish, interestingly. In Latin, it says, Hac postremi hibernici transveriunt principes.
Right. Beautiful, Mac.
Auf Deutsch is, hier resten die letzten Prinzen von Irland durch. And in English, it says, here passed the last of Ireland's princes, March 1608. Fascinatingly, John, this is the place where the Earls, the flight of the Earls, came through in order to get to Milan. So before we talk about Trump and Ukraine, let's talk about the flight of the Earls and the comparison between the two.
Go on.
Right, so the flight of the Earls, there's a 20-year war between Spain and England, the Anglo-Spanish War, which involves the Dutch, which involves the French, but it's mainly between England and Spain. These are the two massive, massive powers, okay? Ireland, of course, is involved because the Spaniards were in alliance with ourselves to try and open up a second front against the English from Ireland. And the bond was Catholicism, anti-Englishness, and mainly anti-Protestantism as well. So we, of course, lose. The Spanish sent their 4th Armada, Battle of Kinsale, 1602, and our crowd lose it, and the English crowd win it.
Yeah.
And Ireland is in
because they misjudged the weather, didn't they? And they went around the top of the island and they all sank.
They sank, and that's where the Black Irish apparently come from in Connemara, people with very dark eyes and very dark hair. They are the offspring of Spanish sailors, etc. So legend has it.
Yeah.
But we know what happened, right? We know that this began the process that broke the power of Gaelic Ireland. And Gaelic Ireland's 2 biggest princes were Red Hugh O'Neill and Hugh O'Donnell, one of Tyrconnell and one of Tyrone.
Yeah.
These were the last of the great Irish chieftains. And they had been harassed and harangued and stymied by various British armies or English armies. It wasn't Britain. Britain didn't exist at the time. Britain didn't even arrive until 1707.
Yeah.
But these English armies had Dutch mercenaries in them and all sorts of things. They were Protestant armies, etc., right? Anti-Spanish. And it's still bizarre. Nobody really quite knows why. On September 1607, the Earls, O'Neill and O'Donnell, decided to abandon Ireland, the flight of the Earls, and they sailed around from Rathmullen in Donegal, around Ireland to Belgium. And they went to Louvain. Louvain was a big monastery at the time. And they made their way from Louvain through Belgium, down the Rhine to Basel, and from Basel they made their way to Lucerne. And from Lucerne, across Lake Lucerne, they were making their way to Milan.
Why? What was the significance of Milan? Why were they going there?
Because Milan was the source of Spanish power in what was then pre-Italy. So the Duchy of Milan had got into a alliance with the King of Spain against who? Our friends, the Phoenicians.
Right.
From last
Okay.
podcast, Venice. Okay, so it's all tied up. So there is a place here called Tiefelbrugge, which means the Devil's Bridge. And I actually went across it yesterday.
Right.
It's a tiny little bridge across a massive ravine. You really do not want to fall down this particular ravine. And you know what happened? Hugh O'Neill's pack horse fell down the ravine at Tiefelsbrugge. And what
Right.
was in the pack of the pack horse? Their gold, which is what they were going to bring to the Spaniards to say, if
Okay.
you come in with us.
Yeah.
But of course, now this is the
And
fascinating
they couldn't
thing. So
retrieve it.
They couldn't retrieve it because it's thousands of meters down.
Yeah,
These are
yeah,
huge mountains. I mean, when I'm looking up, it's just phenomenal, you know. A chap like me with vertigo, there's all sorts of weird things.
I'm surprised you ski at all, you know?
I know. Well, that's another story.
Maybe you don't.
I ski like a donkey. I'm like a newborn foal. I'm a danger to everybody on a piste, right?
Yeah.
So fascinatingly, what happened to O'Neill and O'Donnell when they arrived in Milan is they went to Spain, who were the traditional enemies of England and the traditional friends of Ireland, and the Spaniards rejected them
Oh, how come?
because the Spaniards had signed a peace agreement with the English. So the tectonic plates had shifted. But basically, the English said to the Spaniards, what's in your backyard, you can have.
Mm.
The Spaniards said to the English, what's in your backyard and your sphere of influence, you guys can have it. You sort it out with the Irish, because frankly, it's too far away from us to be
Yeah,
bothered with.
yeah.
We sent 4 armadas up there. We lost loads of men, fought wars. We couldn't
Yeah.
beat you.
We're done.
We're done. We're done with the Irish because the Irish are geographically in the sphere of influence of the English. And frankly, it makes no sense for us to be involved in what they regarded as a kind of an inter-family row. They basically said, the British Isles, Ireland, Scotland, England, you're all part of the same carry-on. Deal it with yourselves. This is why the flight of the Earls was so profoundly tragic for Ireland, because number one, it ended maybe a 1,500-year ascendancy of Gaelic traditions, of Brehon law, the Irish language, of our own cultural, political base and political establishment. And from that, everything flows. It destroyed the leadership, so Ireland became completely and utterly without leaders. And therefore, without leaders, you can't make any sort of negotiation strategy with your opposition. It led to the plantations of Ireland. It led to all the religious wars that we know all about. And more than anything else, fascinatingly, it also signals the end of the English war in Ireland and the betrayal of the Irish by the Spaniards signals the beginning of the British Empire. So from 1606, 1607, the Treaty of London, they signed with the English in 1604. From around then, the British Empire begins to expand. It expands through trade routes first and foremost, and then the British Navy come in to protect the British ships, not unlike what we were talking about Venice last week.
Yeah.
And Britain projects its power out to the Caribbean, to North America, and then around the corner to India eventually.
Yeah.
But the big losers in the tectonic shifts in the plates were the Irish in the early 17th century.
Yeah.
And we didn't recover for 300 years.
And it's, as you mentioned last week, that it's like when elephants start rowing, it's the grass that gets trampled on.
Exactly. Now think about Ukraine. Donald Trump has done a deal, or at least is the basis of a deal, with Putin, not only over the heads of the Ukrainians, without even having them in the room.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
the Ukrainians now are the Irish then. What Trump has basically said to the Russians is, look, that's your sphere of influence. You're Slavic speaking, you know each other, you're co-religionists in most cases. You know what? Sort that out. We are not going to get involved in your war, right? This is exactly what the Spaniards said to the English, which basically exposed the Irish. When you were dependent on the kindness of strangers, the tectonic shifts can force you to be in a position that's incredibly exposed, right? So what is happening right now is the Ukrainians are seen largely by Trump, who doesn't care about NATO, who doesn't care about American commitments over the last 6 decades, who really doesn't care about Europe, or at least pretends he doesn't care about Europe.
Yeah. Well, that's become really clear. Yeah.
He's saying to the Russians, look, you know what? That's your backyard. I'm not going to bother clearing it up. I'm not going to be clearing out your stables, in effect, right?
Yeah.
Clearing out the shite in your stables. You do it.
Yeah.
Which is exactly what Putin was hoping for. And of course, this drives a coach and horses, to stick with our slightly horsey metaphors, John. This drives a coach and horses.
Full of bridges and stuff, yeah.
Horses that fall off bridges, cleaning out stables, all that good stuff, right? But what this does, John, is this drives not a wedge, a battering ram right through the middle of the transatlantic alliance.
So what you're saying is that, because a lot of the criticism over the last few days has been of Trump and the art of the deal, my arse. And, he's already exposed his hand by starting with what he's willing to give up and all that kind of stuff. But what you're saying is that the criticism is ill-founded because he doesn't give a shit.
It's not that he doesn't give a shit. It comes back to the idea. We spoke about McKinley a couple of weeks ago. It came back to the idea of Andrew Jackson.
Yeah.
Actually, both McKinley and Jackson's parents came from Northern Ireland, who were products of the plantation, which was a function of the flight of the Earls. But there you go. But Jackson's idea, the Jacksonian idea, was America can be isolated. America first means America alone. We have 2 huge oceans that separate us from the rest of the world. We have our own food. We have our own energy.
Yeah.
We don't care. And that's, again, what Trump is breaking up. Trump is breaking up the perception or the assumption on the part of Europeans that the Americans actually will always be here to defend us. And the Americans have a strategic interest in Europe, which is so steadfast that nothing at all can change that. And when the Slavic-speaking people of Ukraine and Russia get into a row, the Americans with the Europeans will throw the kitchen sink at the Russians on behalf of the Ukrainians, and that will always be the case. So basically, Europe's eastern flank will always be protected by America. If you're sitting in Berlin or Warsaw, that makes absolute sense. If you're sitting in Canton, Ohio, where we were not so long ago, this doesn't seem to make any sense.
Yeah. There's no connection at all. Yeah.
There's no connection. There's no threat.
Yeah.
And if there's no threat, there's no big deal.
And just to expand it, that way of thinking, the way we're going, to expand that a little bit out to the east, Taiwan is in China's sphere of influence. And they'll go, fire ahead, take Taiwan.
Exactly. So, for example, for the American mind, or some in the American minds, America coming to Europe's aid over Ukraine would be a little bit like Europe coming to Mexico's aid over America.
Yeah.
They're like, doesn't figure. So,
and furthermore, actually, Mac, and it's one of the reasons why America probably will take Greenland, because that, again, is over in the American sphere. Actually, just a quick one on that. One of the Republican senators introduced a bill the other day called the Red, White and Blue Land Bill for America.
But if we come back, John, so let's think of what has happened, because I am seeing the total and utter rubbishing of a policy that has remained central to the European mind for many, many years. I've always thought to myself, and I remember studying this when I was at the College of Europe, and they talk about we built Europe, et cetera, and the European community was a great thing, and it was, and it is still. But it was always constructed under the security umbrella of the United States. It was almost as if the United States allowed the Europeans get on with their little sort of gig, the free tradey thing, and they're this, that, and the other. But you know what? When the push comes to the shove, we are on the ground in Germany, in West Germany.
So were the Europeans a bit naive over the last 50, 60 years?
No, because it was a great deal. It was a free ride deal. a freeze-dried deal is better than a paid deal. You always know that, right?
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
always better fun.
Anything free is good.
It's always better fun to bunk the bus than pay for it.
Yeah.
So the Europeans, the European community was very, very happy to go along with the United States because it didn't require us to do anything like a European army, really unified European foreign policy. And I'm going to come on to this in a little while, it allowed free riders on the free riders to have a really nice time. And unfortunately, the free rider on the free rider is Ireland.
Oh, okay. But what's the Russian angle here? What does it mean for Russia?
Well, I think what we're talking about is the Russians have won the war because Russia, in effect, John, do you remember when the war started? The big fear was that the Russians would play the long game.
Yeah.
And they'd wait for the crack in the European Union. They'd wait for the cracks in the transatlantic alliance. They'd wait for a Trump-type character to emerge. And now he has. And now the game has changed. So let's discuss that after this.
So, Mac, we're 3 years into the war, the anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia.
It's coming up next week. Next week is the 3rd anniversary. We're going to the 4th year of the war.
Yeah. And there's been upwards of 46,000 sanctions implemented against Russia and Russian oligarchs and companies, etc., etc. But they haven't worked. Russia is still there. And as you were just saying a moment ago, Russia has won. Talk to me about that.
The Russians feel now that they have won the long game, that we have folded, the West has folded, that the alliance between the Americans and the Europeans that under Biden was watertight is now not only leaky, but has now been abandoned by the Americans, right?
Yeah.
So number one, their assumption that the Europeans were too fat, too rich, too lazy to really, really get their act together has been proven right because Europe militarily is very exposed over there. That's the first thing. The second thing is that it means that Ukraine, as far as we know, will never be in NATO, which is another massive win for Russia.
Although Starmer says otherwise. Okay, we'll come back to the likes of Starmer, right? But if you're looking at this from the big geopolitical world, yeah,
Russians have won the war, they believe, even though they couldn't take Ukraine with their own army, right? But in the same way as the Germans felt they were stabbed in the back in the First World War, that the army didn't win, the Russians are in a strange situation. Their army didn't win, but Ukraine has been stabbed in the back.
Yeah.
By America.
Yeah.
Okay, this makes Neville Chamberlain look like an incredibly brilliant tactician, right? But basically Trump has said, we're going to fold on this. We're going to go up and we're going to let the Russians have what they want. What they want is no NATO for Ukraine, and we're going to cede the territory that the Russians took. And the Russians took that territory by an illegal war. But Trump doesn't seem to think this. I think the basic problem with this, Jonas, Trump sees Zelensky as the opposition.
Yeah.
He doesn't see Zelensky as his friend.
Well, he's also harboring that resentment to Zelensky because Zelensky wouldn't play his game way
Years
back
ago.
in the first time around. Yeah.
And that's true. That was, where was Hunter's briefcase?
Yes. His laptop.
Where's Hunter's laptop? Okay. Right. But let's come back to the transatlantic alliance. The thing that Putin really wants destroyed has been shattered.
Yeah.
Europe and America are now not moving in tandem.
Yeah.
The Russian economy, as you said, was supposed to be sanctioned to death. Not only was it not sanctioned to death, but it continued to grow during this period.
Yeah.
So what that's proven is that the Russian economy can operate without the West. Now, of course, the big secret here is that China was the sanction buster for the Russians.
Yeah.
Because as long as China was open, Russia could get all their consumer goods that they needed from China, and all they had to do was export energy to China. So the Chinese, had this happened 20 years ago when the Chinese economy was not as significant as it was, Russia would have suffered, but they didn't suffer.
Yeah.
Or if they did suffer, they didn't suffer enough.
Well, what is interesting is now what we've been keep hearing over the last few years is that the Russian economy is about to collapse and people are poor and they can't feed themselves and Putin was sick and all these various different things. But like, was that all kind of, I mean, we spoke before about Potemkin villages and stuff. Was that like the smoke and mirrors?
Well, the key thing is that, just to remind the listeners, the Potemkin village was one of the great illusions that the Russians orchestrated on the West. Catherine the Great takes over Ukraine. Her lover and head of her army, General Potemkin, brings a whole host of Western European and Middle European ambassadors down the Dnieper. And at every turn in the river, there were these very joyous villagers waving at Catherine the Great saying, we love you, it's amazing. So the Europeans were saying, fuck, that's amazing. The Ukrainians weren't subjugated in some apocalyptic civil war. They actually love her. And of course, what was happening was Potemkin was putting up the villages one morning.
Yeah.
And then as the barges went to sleep at night, he'd fold up all the villages and bring them down to the next turn in the roads.
A traveling circus.
Like a traveling circus, right? So that was the particular villages. And you come back to smoke and mirrors. That the Russians, the way they operate is they play the West all the time. And the question is, have we been played again? Have we been played again? Have we allowed ourselves to be lulled into this view that, well, it's only a matter of time? And remember that all that thing about a middle-class Russian will emerge and the middle-class Russians will move against Putin because the middle-class Russians want their Cartier watches and their Apple Macs and all that, right?
Yeah, yeah.
The middle class doesn't exist. It's gone. And that's an interesting other thing, John. The Russia that exists today after the war is not the same Russia as went into the war. Because the Russia that exists today is denuded of what they would call the Russian nationalists, the degenerates. So the oligarchs who were all around, certainly Yeltsin and the first iteration of Putin's regime, they're gone. They're gone. All the liberals are gone. All the LGBT opposition is gone. All the cosmopolitans are gone. And what has replaced it is the Orthodox Church. Remember we talked about the Orthodox Church last week?
Yeah.
And the Tsar and them feeling that Moscow is the new Rome, right? The Orthodox Church and the autocratic system that Putin has created around him, which is the army, the military, the secret service, etc. So the idea is you can live in Russia and you can live well as long as you do not begin to play the game of politics and as long as you don't begin to play the game of the degenerate West.
Yeah.
So the new Russia, the Russia that's there now, is a totally different country to the Russia that went into the war.
So is this new Russia, is it a genuine threat to Europe? Not so much the West, because Trump doesn't care and he's pulled back. So to Europe, are we under threat?
The basic thing is, right, that Russia, that conservative, proto-Slavic, because it's not really Slavic, because once you go east, Russia is an empire of all sorts of different Asiatic tribes and Asiatic nations. So it's kind of Slavic on the surface. But what it is, it's bound by a common language, a common sense of purpose, and a common sense of destiny. This is what the Russians have, which is why you have a strange situation where the Russian economy is no larger, John, than the economy of Belgium and Netherlands put together in GDP terms.
Right.
There's only 130 million of them. There's 450 million Europeans with a much stronger economy, and we are the ones who feel threatened. Now, that is a lamentable indictment of the way in which Europe has not been able to organize itself. So we are the ones who are threatened by a country that is tiny in comparison in terms of power. But what has happened since the war is the Russian military now say, well, look, you said you had all this highfalutin NATO technology, you were going to give the Ukrainians this amazing wham, bam, thank you, man stuff, and that was going to destroy us. Well, you know what? We're still here. We might not necessarily have conquered much of Ukraine, but we're still fighting. So all your technology...
Or the North Koreans are still fighting.
Maybe the North Koreans was all a play.
Yeah.
Maybe it was all a ploy to basically send a signal to the West that Russia is weak, when in fact it was just playing this long game. You know? I mean, this is the way it'll all come out. But it means that the multipolar world is here to stay. So the idea that, there was a unipolar world run by America, the global policeman, or we used to call the arsenal of democracy, that's gone. There's a multipolar world of which America, Russia, and China are now the significant players. And the babble of languages and cultures that is Europe is a long way back in second place. A long, long way back. We weren't even at the table.
Yeah.
And you know what they say? If you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And that is the problem, right? And so taking the whole thing together, we are looking, John, now, I think, at a new world order emerging. So since 1991, since the abdication of, or the coup attempt against Gorbachev, August 1991, the Russians, stroke Soviet Union, whatever you want to call it, okay, because it was one and the same thing, has been subservient to and the junior partner to the Western Alliance. The Western Alliance being America, run by the State Department, and the European Union, run by the bureaucracy in Brussels, in effect. What has happened now is that the MAGA boys have come in.
Yeah.
They dislike the bureaucratic nature of the EU. They have championed every single political party that has been out to break the EU, like Brexit, like Le Pen, like Meloni, right? If you think about it, like Orban, all these guys, the MAGA guys have championed. They've decided they don't like the EU for a variety of reasons. And what can then, the next iteration of that is they decided that they can break the EU. And this is one of their long-term strategies. And the EU right now is like a rabbit in the headlights. They don't know what to do. Are we NATO? Are we European? Et cetera, et cetera. Do we have a European army? Why not? Can we reindustrialize? Why not? What can we remilitarize? Et cetera. So, I mean, the whole world that in our adult life seemed to be permanent is now gone. And it's been destroyed in a matter of days. So now at the Munich Conference of Peace and Security, you have the Americans saying, well, we're not going to hang around. You guys, I mean, basically the Americans are treating the Europeans like pathetic second cousins who are frankly an embarrassment at the wedding. We all have a cousin that has been an embarrassment at the wedding. That's us, right? That is us. And we don't know what to do. And of course, then Ireland, if we just end, John, we started the Treaty of London.
Yeah.
The sphere of influence, Red Hugh O'Donnell, the flight of the Earls, the end of Irish Gaelic culture, all happened. Why? Because we misdiagnosed where the power was going. Had the Earls stuck around, they may well have been able to be leaders in a changed world, but they fled, leaving the country abandoned. And if you have no leaders, you're gone. So we were gone for 200 years. Start there. And all we can say, John, is that the world has shifted and tilted on its axis. The old world that we all assumed was here to stay is gone. The new world and the new world order has been set up. We don't know what it's going to look like, but I can definitely estimate that what it's going to imply is a massive change, not just for Europe, not just for America, but for little old Ireland too. We're going to have to change as well. And it's all to play for.